Hi everyone, welcome to the 12th Australian Media Traditions Conference. My name is Dr. Mark C. Scott. I'm convening the conference for this year. Before we begin, I would like to welcome Janet, who will be giving us a welcome to country. Thanks, Janet.
Wominjeka. Wominjeka is the Bunwurrung language word for come with purpose, which is very fitting considering that everything we do from waking in the morning to sleeping in the evening is done with purpose. And today, your purpose is to be here for the Victoria University Australian Traditions Online Conference. We also acknowledge how trying the last 18 months has been and congratulate you all on being here today, and to recognise that this last 18 months is unprecedented and like no other challenge that we have all faced in our lives. None of us yet know or understand where our future will take us, but please know that all your colleagues are in the same boat and that you must reach out for any kind of help or assistance that you do require to see you through your days. So welcome all of you on whichever country it is that you are on today. And my purpose today is to perform a welcome to country to formally welcome you on behalf of the Yalukit of the Bunwurrung, whose lands I am on today. This country is unceded land. I am a direct descendant from our First Peoples and cousin to Nawit, Dr. Carolyn Briggs AM, the elder of the Bunwurrung and the Yalukit clan. And I am here today representing her. But I also acknowledge my Irish and English ancestors. So to our ancestors, we pay our respect not just today, but always to all of our ancestors, those people who came before us. The Bunwurrung are the custodians of the lands that extend from Wilson's Promontory to Werribee, encompassing both of our beautiful bays, Western Port and Port Phillip. And we are especially pleased to recognise the commitment that you've made here today in paying respect to the spirit of this land and to its First Peoples. Through this, you have shown the willingness to honour sacred ground. We are spiritually and culturally connected to this country by the thousands of generations of our ancestors. This country is in our DNA, and that is why connection to country is so important to our First Peoples. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were this country's first explorers, first navigators, first engineers, first farmers, first botanists, first scientists, first diplomats, first astronomers, first teachers, first artists, first healers, and also first lawmakers. Australia also has the world's oldest oral stories, and the First Peoples engraved the world's first maps and made the very earliest paintings of ceremony. And the very first footprints on this continent were those belonging to our First Peoples. But unfortunately, our First Peoples are unknown to many who live in this land. As people of the continent, now known as Australia, while we may have descended from different clans, different language groups, and from countries all across the world, we ask that you support our elders' rights for a voice to government. Our rights for a treaty, which Victoria is on that pathway, and for the truth-telling to be told about Australia's dark history. And again, here in Victoria, a Truth and Justice Commission is now underway for this purpose. So Victoria is really leading the way, and we are hoping that all of the other states will follow. The word Wominjeka, as I said earlier, translates to come with purpose. But it's also a contract between the people as the custodians of this land and yourselves to ensure that the laws of Bunjil, our creator, are adhered to, and to guarantee safe passage for those who ask. According to tradition, our land has always been protected by our creator Bunjil, who travels as an eagle, and our waterways are protected by Wa, who travels as a crow. Bunjil taught us the responsibility that we have for this land and to always welcome guests. But we have to ask all guests to commit to two promises that we ask of you here today. One is not to harm the land of Bunjil, and two, to not harm the children of this beautiful land. And if we can commit ourselves to these two promises, we live in a better world. This commitment was made through the exchange of a small bough of leaves being dipped into the waters and the spoken words, Waminjika. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Janet. Well, thank you everyone for being here. I just wanted to quickly address, obviously, the key theme for this conference, which is exploring the regions. In 2019, at the last Australian Media Traditions Conference, which was held at University of Melbourne, we were living in a very different world then. And there was quite a few of us who were all looking at the future of what we would do for media traditions in the following 2 years. Exploring the regions and this idea around regional media was really something that was at the core of many who were there at that conference. So that's the key reason for wanting to really explore regional media, and something that I think hasn't been explored as much as it potentially should be. For me, I grew up in Shepparton, a regional town. So I grew up with GV6, which some of you may be aware, a regional television station. As Janet touched on, the last 18 months has been a very challenging time, and we need to acknowledge that. I do want to thank all the presenters who will present over the coming 2 days, not only for what you're going to do for the conference over the coming days, but everything that has happened before that. There are people I need to thank. Without their assistance, this conference wouldn't have happened. Firstly, to the VU events team, Asha, Josh in particular, who have assisted in getting the schedule ready, all of the Zoom sessions ready, and a number of other things in supporting me. Vic Uni for their support in allowing us to host this conference, and in addition, all the in-kind support that they've given to the conference, which has allowed us to do very cheap tickets in the hope that we could get as many possible to attend the sessions. There are two other people I would like to thank. Sybil, who at the previous conference, who has assisted me with things from the previous conference and giving me advice. But the other person I think has been a key in supporting me and guiding me to get to the point where we are now is Bridget. I'm going to welcome her in a moment, but one of the things I wanted to mention that we've changed this year and brought into the AMT conference, and I hope it's something that we can carry on for future conferences, is to name the rooms after key scholars who have not only impacted the discipline areas that the conference covers, but also have impacted the conference more broadly. And so I'd like to introduce Bridget to talk about the 4 people that we've named the rooms after for AMT 2021. Thanks, Bridget.
Thank you, Mark, and of course, Janet, for that very warm welcome. It's lovely to be here this morning, and I really was delighted when Mark contacted Sybil, Nolan and I several weeks ago to suggest that what had become the Zoom rooms for AMT 2021 being named after notable Australian media scholars. So the 3 of us put our heads together and came up with the names that you will see on page 5 of your booklet. As the co-convener of the First Australian Media Traditions Historical Perspectives Conference in 1999, I can report that 3 of these scholars were actually there. Now, forgive me if you've heard this story before, but some of you would be aware that the conference was an idea, a thought bubble that occurred to David McKnight and Curthoys and I at another history conference in the late 1990s. We remarked to each other over a morning tea, wouldn't it be good if there was something like a media history conference? David and I proceeded to organise the First Amt Conference, which was held at the State Library of New South Wales in September 1999. And there were a couple of misfortunes early on. We lost a speaker and we lost the teaspoons. The speaker was more important. Now, I actually can't remember who that was, someone we had programmed, but I rang Anne Curthoys a night or two before the conference to ask for some advice on what we should do. And she suggested that we ask Sylvia Lawson to see if she would be prepared to speak at the conference. So that was really the first time I'd met Sylvia. She stepped in brilliantly and beautifully, and she spoke partly about her work on the classic book, The Archibald Paradox. As I was sitting at the registration desk that morning, Clem Lloyd, who'd examined my PhD thesis, arrived. I had been in touch with Clem when David McKnight and I had come up with the idea for the conference. Clem had offered us his support, especially if we needed it financially. And then Clem, being Clem, didn't respond to a lot of subsequent emails, and bearing in mind in the late 1990s, email wasn't quite the driving communication force in our lives that it was today. So I knew that Clem was going to speak at the conference. We programmed him, but he arrived not just with a paper, but with a checkbook to offer to cover any costs should we run at a loss. We didn't need that, thankfully, but that really was a sign of Clem's personal as well as scholarly generosity. I also vividly recall that first morning at the registration desk for another reason, and that's because Prue Tawny Parlicki, as she was then, she and I had both done our PhDs around the same time. We'd met previously, but she came to the desk armed with a copy of my first book, The House of Packer, which was coming out that month. I wasn't aware that the book was had arrived in bookshops. Prue had worked this out, gone to the library shop, bought the book, and came across to the desk and asked me to sign the book. So Prue was the first person who really made me feel like an author. And Tom, I'm not quite sure when Tom O'Regan, which was the first AMT conference he came to, but I know that by the 2011 conference, he put his hand up to convene at the University of Queensland the next AMT conference. Tom was also a little bit like Clem, disappeared somewhat, didn't reply to a lot of emails. A few of us became nervous about whether AMT would go ahead, but Tom had always been planning to do it. And so he and a colleague co-convened the conference at UQ in 2013. At the AMT conference in 2015, both Tom and Sylvia were there. We did have a film screening in the National Film and Sound Archive Theaterette on, I think, the last evening of the conference. And then a few of us who were still in town went out to dinner afterwards. And I remember my husband driving myself with Tom and Sylvia in the car. And it was clear how long their association was. Sylvia's health wasn't wonderful at that point, so we dropped her off at her apartment. but we did go on and have dinner with Tom and others, such as Jock, given I seem to recall was there. Tom would go on to write Sylvia's obituary for the Australian Academy of the Humanities, and little did we know that he would develop cancer not so long afterwards. So Clem, Prue, Sylvia, Tom, if you didn't have the fortune that I did to meet all of them, please read about them on page 5 of the abstracts booklet. Celebrate their lives and their scholarship. Mark, thank you so much for this really lovely idea, and have a great conference, everyone.
Thanks, Bridget. So I want to now move on to our first keynote speaker. This is for the KS Inglis Address, and the title is Regional Media Landscapes and Rural Imaginaries. Our keynote speaker for this is Dr. Lisa Waller, who is a professor of digital communication in the School of Media and Communication at RMIT University, Australia. Since entering academia in 2007, Lisa has published widely in media and communication studies. Her research is concerned with how the media shapes society, from Indigenous affairs policy to its role in regional and rural identity, the administration of justice and people's everyday practices. Lisa is a 2021 Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the University of Canberra, a member of the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, and is a research associate in the Centre for Rural Criminology at the University of New England. Before academia, Lisa was a journalist, and she worked for the Australian Financial Review before entering her academic life. I want to thank Lisa for all the time, the conversations that we've had prior to this, and thank you for taking up the role to complete the KS Inglis Address for AMT 2021. Thank you, Lisa.
I just wanted to say thanks to Mark for the warm introduction, and good morning, everyone. And a big thank you to Auntie Janet for that really wonderful welcome to country. It's a great honour to be invited to give the Ken Inglis Address here in the Tom O'Regan room. And I just really thank the organisers for the opportunity. When I was thinking about the best way to acknowledge country today, the map of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations seemed like the most fitting way to begin when the conference theme is exploring the regions. I'm coming to you from Wadawurrung country, which is part of the group of Western Kulin nations in the south of the continent. The map of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations reminds us that the settler concept of regions and of regional Australia furthers that great Australian silence that Bill Stanner, in his famous 1968 Boyer lecture called A Cult of Forgetfulness, that conveniently ignores the sovereignty and the 600,000 plus year histories of the nations on the map we're looking at now. These ancient countries are unceded lands, as Auntie Janet said, and in paying respect to both Boon Wurrung and Wadawurrung countries, I also acknowledge elders past and present and any First Nations scholars who are among us today. And I just really encourage everybody to post a greeting in the comments field for this start of the conference, acknowledging the country and the people of the First Nations where you are today. And throughout the conference, when we're talking about regions, let's try to remember the First Nations map and how it invites us all to see and acknowledge the true histories of this continent. Now, you might be wondering why I've got a photo here of grand illusionist Constantino and professional dancer Jessica Raffa. Obviously, it's Dancing with the Stars. And we've already talked a little bit about previous AMTs, thanks to Bridget's reminiscences. I attended my first AMT conference in Brisbane, which was organised by Tom, as Bridget said. So that was back in 2013 when these guys won the series. And it is, as Mark said at the beginning, it's amazing to think how much the media's changed in less than a decade. I remember Bridget actually hurrying back from dinner to her accommodation so she could watch the show in its regular primetime slot on commercial TV. It was an age before smart TVs and streaming services and the major mergers, restructures and closures that have brought significant change to the contours of Australia's news media landscape since then. And I suppose we all know very well that change is the constant in media studies, and taking a historical perspective to understanding change just offers so much. And it's a really big part of why we're all gathered at our screens together today. The ABC's Laura Tingle gave the Ken Inglis Address at the last AMT conference at the University of Melbourne in 2019. I'm sure all of you can pick Laura there. She's second from the left. I wonder whether you can pick some of the other prominent Australian journalists in that shot. At the time of the last AMT, I was working on a book chapter about media representations of the 1991 Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. And I had PDFs of the relevant news coverage, the front pages and other pages, at my fingertips on the computer while Laura was speaking. And her observations about changes in political journalism over 30 years of her career, when she contrasted straight reportings of events, you know, when people went to press conferences like the one you're looking at, contrasting that with today's style of endless reaction and commentary. And I could see this actually borne out in the collection of Metropolitan news front pages from the day in May 1991 when the 5-volume Royal Commission report was handed down. Journalists then played a straight bat. They summarised the key findings of the report. They went out and did a colour story. The commentary was to be found in the editorials. I used the newspaper reading room at the State Library of Victoria to source those front pages. It's such a rich and accessible resource for academics when we can get in there. I'm not talking about media preservation and archiving this morning, but it's a really important focus of the conference. And I'm sure many of you share a passion for working with archival material and for protecting and investing in our archives. This shot is from the newspaper reading room in the beautiful Mechanics Institute in Ballarat, which is where I live and where I've recently been doing some research. It's got a wonderful regional newspaper collection from this part of southwestern Victoria. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm a journalist and a journalism and media scholar. I was a journalist with an interest in news and media that goes beyond the city limits. I don't describe myself as a historian at all. I'm a critical cultural researcher for whom context, or should I say contexts, are everything. And the contexts of my inquiry include histories, geographies, social, economic, and of course, political contexts. But for me, histories come first, not only in a temporal sense. In planning for today, I've been acquainting myself with the life and work of Ken Inglis, who I'm sure everybody knows has been one of the nation's finest historians to date. He was also a journalist and a pioneer of press criticism. His contributions to journalism are celebrated by his inclusion in the Australian Media Hall of Fame, and our Australian media traditions community celebrates his contributions to history, journalism, and Australian life through this conference address. I've been considering the key themes in his work to try to find some connections with my own for this talk, and to try to speak to some of those today. And I think that they really revolve around place, identities, and media. Well, that's good. Well, here we are. Here we have a lovely visual for you. And I'll just resume by saying that the conference theme this year couldn't really be more topical, with city dwellers leaving the metropolis and heading to the regions in droves, and media focusing on this very much as a positive and an interesting kind of distraction from the usual COVID news. I think the place of digital media in all of this is quite interesting as well. Here in Ballarat, I've met people from Melbourne who've been in their new homes having only had a virtual inspection via the internet. When we talk about regions in Australia, we look beyond the city, even though all cities are part of a region in Australia. So when we think about regions in media studies, we're also thinking about place and space. And I might add that the historical interplay between city and country was an abiding interest of Ken Inglis. The fortunes and futures of regional media have also become a regular national news story in recent times, with important community, policy and economic dimensions. The loss of regional TV news bulletins, country newspaper closures and migration to online, along with ABC budget cuts that have weakened its regional offerings, and new entrants determined to fill the gaps, have not only made the news, they've been the subject of a series of government inquiries and reforms. In scholarship, these themes have propelled the once unfashionable topic of small town journalism to the forefront in Australia and internationally. And this is reflected in the literature by increasing attention to media business models, innovation for the sector, and of course the twin threats of news deserts and democratic deficits. I know these topics will be explored in important papers across the conference, so I'm going to keep my remarks on this pretty brief. Obviously, the global pandemic has affected everything, including regional media, where it's really amplified the challenges and the opportunities the sector was already facing. As of March 2020, when this all began for us here in Australia, there were an estimated 578 regional and rural newspapers. And in the 10-year period from 2008 to 2018, 106 local and regional newspaper titles, many of them were suburban, closed across the country, leaving 21 local government areas without coverage from a single local newspaper in either print or online. And 16 of these LGAs are in regional Australia, according to the ACCC. Since that time in 2020, we've seen many more regional newspapers close their doors or move to online only, sparking discussion of these news outlets deserving support as an essential service. I've talked a bit about the papers, but Win TV has slashed more jobs and closed some of its regional operations in parts of Queensland, Victoria and New South Wales. And that trend continues across the media spectrum. In regional radio, Southern Cross Austereo cut 38 jobs in 2020 in a move to centralise its breakfast shows across the country. This is the last wave of disappointment and uncertainty to crash on regional journalism. It comes on top of the 2021 mandatory bargaining code. That's good news for the larger legacy players like News Corporation that stand to gain the most, but might not serve the interests of the small independent players like so many little country newspapers and radio stations, unless they can band together to negotiate a good collective deal with the tech giants. On the other hand, entrepreneurs have seized the COVID moment to launch new ventures at the local and hyperlocal level, including the high-profile story of global financial success Michael Waite, returning to his hometown of Narracourt in South Australia to start up a new newspaper, the Narracourt Community News, when the News Corporation-owned Narracourt Herald shut its doors. I'm currently contributing to the Media Innovation and the Civic Future of Australia's Country Press ARC Linkage project, which is led by Deakin University's Christy Hess, in partnership with Country Press Australia. This project aims to move beyond merely documenting these challenges that we've been talking about here, to seek some innovative solutions that can help to secure the sustainability of that news network's 170 mastheads. We've recently conducted a survey of Country Press readers to gain their insights about innovation for the sector. So I just thought I'd quickly share some of that with you because it's really quite interesting, I think. Just on 4,200 people around the country took the survey. And the key finding was an overwhelming preference for print across all age groups. 86% of people also thought that the printed version of the newspaper was an essential service. I think that's a real COVID times finding. We asked respondents about the policy debates and interventions shaping the future of local news, and those results showed that country press audiences believe they have much to actively contribute in charting the innovation agenda for news sustainability. 94% said they strongly believe they should be invited to have a say about government policies and decisions that affect the future of their local papers. And 61% said government policies affecting their local media could affect their vote at the upcoming federal election. And I think it's really significant that 51% indicated they'd be prepared to join a Friends organisation like Friends of the ABC, if such a thing existed for country newspapers. If that existed, 51% of people said they'd be on board. So as I've said on the slide there, I think when we go to audiences and ask them what they think, which policymakers and industry often don't do, we get a very important picture of what matters out there in the countryside. I've long been interested in the unevenness of the media landscape across varied geographic settings, especially between the city and regional, rural and remote settings. And there are a few different ways I've worked with this idea, including as it relates to Indigenous media representation and to media representations of crime. I've been influenced all the way along, really, by Pierre Bourdieu's tradition of field-based research, and especially its basic relational insight that how you see and how you understand the world varies systematically depending on your relative position in social space. Let me say a few words about media representations of remote Indigenous communities first. The ABC's Four Corners program is currently celebrating its 60th anniversary. And a couple of months ago, it ran a special looking back over its history, which I'm sure many of you saw. A key point was that early in its day, a big part of its brief was to go out into regional and remote areas of Australia to inform city people about what life was like out in the bush, where relatively few people from the city used to venture back in the day. The anniversary show emphasised that some of the most impactful reporting that Four Corners did in the early days from remote locations, and not just in the 1960s actually, into the 1980s and right up until now, have been its Aboriginal stories that draw attention to issues of social injustice and disadvantage and played a role in advancing policy and public discussion, especially in the 1960s when its exposés about things like the Wave Hill wage case and poverty and other matters helped to create pressure for the 1967 referendum. There are really complex geographic and ontological distances that mainstream journalists covering remote communities have to negotiate in dealing with First Nations and government sources, as well as their faraway newsrooms when they go to these places to tell their stories. And the journalists I've interviewed over the years who do that kind of work attribute many of the difficulties with covering remote Indigenous issues to factors linked with these physical and cultural distances. Remote reporting is one of the most expensive forms of Australian news reporting, so it's quite difficult to get newsrooms that are economically stretched to pay. Often what happens is that reporters find themselves hitching rides with government ministers and policymakers and then really being held captive to their agendas while they're there. And there are weak connections between mainstream news outlets and remote First Nations audiences, as well as with audiences on the eastern seaboard of Australia and remote First Nations communities. Yet, as the Four Corners program emphasised, the nation relies on these city-based mainstream journalists to know, or in Benedict Anderson's terms, to imagine remote Indigenous Australians and the policies that govern their close relationship with the state. Through these interviews with journalists and analysis of the text that they produce, I've argued previously that Indigenous affairs reporting on remote communities is not perceived to be of very high news value, really, unless the stories fit routine frames of crisis, violence, or political controversy. And I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about. I think the 2007 Northern Territory intervention is, in Barbie Zellers's terms, the critical incident for this kind of reporting, for those of us that study these things, and a key moment for understanding the power of these media representations to actually shape the lived reality of First Nations peoples. I'll be returning to media representations of regional First Nations a little bit later too, but I'm going to talk about crime for a little bit now. I'm quite fascinated by media representations of crime, and I found it to be a really interesting and productive space for exploring power relations, the dynamics between the state, the media and the population. Some of my early work focused on how regional newspapers in Victoria cover magistrates' court, And I became especially interested in the routine reporting of non-convictions for minor crimes, things like shoplifting, minor acts of vandalism or urinating in a public place. And with non-convictions, a big part of a finding of guilty is not having a record of the crime being put against your name. So the idea from the court's point of view is that you shouldn't have to wear the moral stain of that crime. That in effect, you get a second chance to rehabilitate away from the public gaze. So when non-convictions are reported in the small town newspaper, I ask myself, what role is the regional media playing in exerting that powerful mark of shame that the court says a person really shouldn't have to bear? I've argued this form of reporting polices the boundaries of acceptable behaviour beyond the remit of the courts. And what's more, through content analysis, it became very clear that you're much, much more likely to have your minor crime and a non-conviction finding reported in a regional or rural newspaper than you are in a metropolitan daily or even a suburban weekly. So this is a form of reporting that really plays out at the regional level. I think it's really fascinating. At the other end of the scale, I've taken an interest in examining where a heinous crime has been committed in a regional location and the big media come to town to cover it. Think about historical cases such as the Belanglos forest killings of Ivan Milat and the Snowtown serial killings, where big media closely associates the crime with the place. I've looked at how the local newspaper takes on a rehabilitative role in helping to repair and restore the regional community's sense of identity against the big media portrayal of their place. It's actually a really great trivia topic for any of you that are into designing trivia contests. Can anyone here name the key Snowtown killer? His name is Richard Bunting. Do you know that none of the victims or the perpetrators were from Snowtown? And that only one of the victims was murdered there of the 11 people that were killed. So it's no wonder really that people from Snowtown were, and I guess would continue to be, quite upset that their town's identity has been so closely associated with the crimes by big media, and that local journalists really felt compelled to take on this special role of helping people to feel better about the place where they live. More recently, I've been interested in two things that might not seem so closely related to begin with, which is how national television has used pastoral backdrops to position the use of crystal methamphetamine, or ice, as a scourge of regional Australia, mainly for city-based audiences, and how Country Hour, the ABC's and perhaps the world's longest-running radio program, represents the rural space, First Nations, and issues like climate change. These links are theoretical around this idea of a rural imaginary. So I hope that will become quite clear soon, those links. I'll begin with the mediated regional ice crisis before extending out and finishing the address on special rural reporting. It's well recognised within cultural criminology that crime and place are in some complex, significant and researchable ways entangled. It's even called a crime scene. People's sensibilities towards crime depend on their sense of place, and their orientation to place is, in part at least, determined by considerations of crime and order. We all want to live in a quiet, peaceful street. We don't want crime. Scholars working on the relationship between crime and place have argued that place here has a double articulation. It acts as a physical context for everyday life, but it's also imaginary and it's subjective. Another way of saying this is that place is space with felt value, emotionalised space, or space with feeling. And again, drawing on Benedict Anderson's analysis of the nation as an imagined community, Charles Taylor has described the social imaginary as the ways people imagine their social existence, how they fit together with others, how things go on between people, and the expectations that are normally met, and the deeper normative notions and images that underlie these expectations. So extending on Taylor's work, we can define the social imaginary in media studies, I think, as the collective use of stories and images to legitimate certain practices and articulate their meaning for a community. For example, Christopher Mays has recently written about an agrarian imaginary, which operates to make certain practices of rural life meaningful for urban communities. Mays says it's not really a matter of people choosing to adopt or reject these ideas. They're not recorded or expressed really explicitly. Instead, as individuals and as communities, we're socialised into traditions and into histories and into practices that operate very much in the background, yet make it possible to understand particular objects, activities and subjects as meaningful. Indeed, the enduring significance of rural communities is often connected to their storied role in evoking vital elements of national culture. Incidentally, I'll just pause here for a moment to say that civic identity was a topic that Ken Inglis wrote about extensively, especially figures like the shearer in relation to the labour movement in Australia, very much inviting people to think more broadly about identity making and Australian culture. So in developing the concept of an agrarian imaginary, scholars have been inspired by the cultural turn in rural studies since the 1990s, very much recognising, as Inglis did, the importance of culture within rurality and its definitions, and focusing attention on representations of the rural. For example, a scholar called Michael Bell, who works in this space, distinguishes between two types of rural. First, rural is the most common definition and typically derives its meaning in binary relation to urban spaces. So we think about the country and the city, or the regions and the metropolis. Given the limitations of first rural and this binary, Bell's idea of second rural is informed by culture and what he calls ghosts of place. And I think it's more useful to sociological analyses. He explains that second rural is a rural of associations. And as a concept, the rural of ideas is also sensitive to invisible othernesses, interrogating intersections of power and culture in the rural. And in practice, the public draw on second rural to locate the other among unfamiliar racial and cultural groups and less travelled spaces like rural and remote regions of Australia. For the work on media representations of ice use in regional Australia, I looked at both newspaper coverage, but then really focused in on 3 TV news features that aired on the ABC, SBS and the 7 network between 2014 and 2017. The first theme to emerge was perverting the rural idol. So sociologist Herbert Gans was the first person to conceptualise what he termed small-town pastoralism back in the late 1970s. So he talked about this very much as a news bias that favoured rural areas. In this view of things, Gans said small towns were understood as inherently peaceful and safe and able to provide a haven from the corrupting influence of the city. They were the repositories of good family and community values and very much undeserving of crime. And each of the programs that I looked at, these television programs, included markers of rural serenity, such as pastoral vistas and portrayals of farm life that are assumed to be anathema to crime. But they also used aspects of the other side of second rural to construct the small town ice epidemic, including poverty, isolation and desolation. I'm going to try to play a clip from the SBS feature, and apologies if the sound doesn't work. I can easily tell you what it's about. So just shout out and let me know if there's a problem with the sound.
First time I took it, it literally took me a week until I was going, where can I get some more of that? Because that was pretty awesome. It's the hardest thing to resist that I've ever had. I didn't realise that until I sort of fell down the rabbit hole myself, and I was like, wow, everyone's doing this. It was only costing me a couple of $100 a day. I was using anything from half a gram to a gram a day. And to everyone else, that was between $500 and $800. It was cheaper for me because I was selling it, simple as that. It basically controlled me. From the minute I got out of bed in the morning, I was on it straight away. in that first 6 months at hospital, I was tumbling for it all the time. But you have to tell yourself, no, dude, you got to get through this. You got to get through this. If I didn't, who knows where I'd be now. I'll always consider myself.
I'll just stop it there. I think you can see quite clearly the way that that second rural is being used there, with that imagery of the abandoned car park, the shopping trolley, the hoodie in the graffitied telephone box. The enduring significance of regional and rural communities is often connected to their symbolic place in Australian culture. And this was nowhere more evident than in the Channel 7 program, which was hosted by news and entertainment personality Ray Martin. And I'm going to play a little bit of that for you now. It relies really heavily on bush iconography that remains, I think, very central to our national identity and our values today. And one of the arguments that I'm trying to make here is that all three programs draw on and promote a very distinctive Australian imaginary that's different to a British one or, say, an American one. That's very, very obvious from the clip I'm about to play.
Born in the bush, I've spent a lifetime wandering this fantastic land of ours. Country towns with their special Aussie character make me feel at home, wandering with my camera. We'll all be ruined, said Hanrahan in the iconic Aussie poem, by drought or by floods or bushfires, by natural disasters. But this crisis is very different. It's man-made. And everybody knows somebody who's been hurt.
Projected across such a conservative populist rural of ideas, drug epidemics hold really considerable purchase and proffer this awful shock of danger amid that very wholesome image that Ray Martin's presenting there. And I just want to come back to the beginning of the talk where we were looking at news sustainability to say that in 2020, just last year, Ray Martin was hired, he was hired by a party of major media companies, including ACM, Australian Community Media, Prime, Southern Cross Austereo, and Win, as the front man in ads that ran across TV, radio, and newspapers, as well as a website that was called Save Our Voices. And basically, this was calling for changes to Australia's media ownership laws to save regional media. And Ray's line was, "Your local media just wants a fair go." Once again, summoning up this really key concept in our national culture. And I think it would be really interesting to analyse those advertisements, and in particular Martin's role, looking at this other kinds of work that he's doing. I think it's really rare for scholars of media sustainability to consider some of these more cultural reads of such debates. And it's an area that, I would just encourage people at the conference to be thinking creatively about, how we can look at how some of these debates play out in a cultural sense. So now let's move on to talking about specialist rural reporting and ABC Rural's flagship program, Country Hour, which has also escaped much scholarly attention until recently. Although I must say I'm really looking forward to Jennifer Bowen's presentation tomorrow on ABC's Town and Country Hour, which was the forerunner of Country Hour. In his research on urban agriculture, so thinking about things like urban farms and farmers markets and community gardens, Christopher Mays traces the history of Anglo-American agrarian philosophy and investigates the way certain themes and histories are emphasised while others are discounted. He argues that contemporary proponents of agrarian social thought focus far too heavily on agrarian virtues such as self-reliance, interdependence, sustainability, and community. As a result, he says they fail to address the possibility of agrarian vices such as greed. And what happens then is that basically we effectively ignore or marginalise historical practices of agrarian violence, exclusion, and dispossession, which runs the risk of such vices going unchecked and unnoticed. In the Anglo-American world, agrarian political thought draws heavily from the ideas of Thomas Jefferson, who famously remarked that farmers are the most valuable citizens. There are three principles that drive Jeffersonian agrarianism. The first is that every man has a natural right to hold some land, that agriculture is the mother of organised society, and that it provides the conditions for private property. Jefferson and American colonial thought drew on 17th century English philosopher John Locke's work to justify the idea that farmers who occupy and improve the land thereby have a natural right to it. Agrarian political thought stemming from Jefferson emphasises the importance of farming for the creation of property and a stable democracy, leading to the valorisation of small-scale agriculture as the primary concern for the state. However, these practices can also be considered an agrarian vice, historically tied to the colonial legacy of stolen lands and violence. In Australia, the legal concept of terra nullius, or land belonging to no one, was used to justify the British occupation of Indigenous lands for settlement and agriculture because they were quite wrongly regarded as uncultivated and therefore ownerless. I'll come back to agrarian political thought in a moment, but first I want to say that specialist rural news media in Australia has always been political and it's always been powerful. Here we have a few of the key specialist rural newspapers: The Land, the Stock Journal and the Weekly Times. They're all agricultural weeklies. Many of you will be familiar with them all. The Land is a New South Wales-based paper that was first published in 1911 and was launched as the official mouthpiece and I'm quoting here, the key weapon of the New South Wales Farmers and Settlers Association. According to Vernon Graham and Andrew Norris, the Land's founders set out to create a newspaper with the power and the influence to ensure the voice of farmers could not be drowned out by city-based politicians, media, lobbyists, and business leaders that were seeking to place their interests above agriculture and country people. Over the decades, it was transformed from a one newspaper company into a regional and rural publishing giant named Rural Press Limited. It gradually gobbled up all of its rivals in New South Wales, merged with Fairfax Media and is now part of ACM. I won't talk about them all at great length, but I will say Stock Journal, which is the one some of you might not have heard of before, has been published in Adelaide since 1904, first under the title the Adelaide Stock and Station Journal. It covers livestock, wool and grain markets, and after a few years it was subtitled as the official organ of the Adelaide Wool Brokers Association and the South Australian Stockmen's Association. It was also part of Rural Press and is also now owned by ACM. It's interesting that both the Land and the Weekly Times refer to themselves as the Bible of the Bush. So we have two Bibles in the bush. And the Land and the Stock Journal have this common heritage as official organs of powerful settler agricultural lobbies. And both these points, I think, go to their claim to authority and also to the politicised nature of media in the specialised rural space. The ABC is often accused of left-wing bias, but hardly anyone ever seems to think to point to ABC Rural and its conservative bias, even when the Liberal Party voted in 2018 to privatise the ABC, with the exception of ABC Rural, on the grounds that it somehow serves the national interest. Think about agrarian political thought here for a moment. The research I've been involved with for the past few years argues very much that that interest is in fact the interest of rural elites and their conservative backers in the Liberal National Coalition. Of course, Ken Inglis wrote about Country Hour in his magisterial 2-volume History of the National Broadcaster, and discussion of Country Hour rightly comes in the first official volume of Inglis's history, but the ABC wouldn't support the second volume. And I sometimes wonder whether there'll ever be a third volume, and if there is, what it might say about the ABC now. Country Hour, to me, is a really interesting program. It was established in 1945, and it's the nation's longest running radio program. Each state has its own local edition, so much like the papers, it's very state-based, which I think, again, speaks to Australia's colonial history. And it's broadcast at midday each weekday on the ABC's respective regional radio stations throughout the country. It's very much part of ABC Rural, and a documentary from 2015 that explores its history provides evidence, very clear evidence, of the supportive relationship between this arm of the ABC and the Conservative National Party. I've published a couple of papers on Country Hour with my colleagues, Emma Messy-Cameron and Brian Burkett, and we've presented evidence in those papers through both quantitative and qualitative content analysis that Country Hour does perpetuate a settler colonial discourse that legitimates and valorises the use of rural space for non-Indigenous people, concepts and activities in which First Nations are quite noticeably absent and silent. We've argued Country Hour can therefore be conceptualised as an Australian media space that continues to transmit settler colonialism and its attendant myths. We've since turned our attention to Country Hour's coverage of issues affecting the Murray-Darling Basin in the 2018-2019 summer, including the catastrophic Menindee fish kills and the Watergate scandal that played out in the lead up to the federal election. A critical discourse analysis of the coverage across 4 states within the Murray-Darling Basin found that it very much reinforced the program and its elite sources' prevailing ideology of agrarian rights and virtues, especially through the program presenters contextualising commentary. And I think that's a really important point to make, that it's actually the presenters and journalists that frame the discourse. The program legitimated the productive use of the river system and the agricultural sector's interests above all else. It politicised the issue and it shifted responsibility for the river's well-being away from irrigators, away from climate change, and away from Conservative politicians, creating very significant absences and silences, I would argue, in the process. I mentioned earlier that a big part of Four Corners' early mission was to bring the bush to the city. What I'm at pains, I guess, to emphasise here is that this is often done in ways that draw on mythic frames and these settler ideas of the bush. Some of those frames that Ken Inglis talked about in his Histories of the Nations. There's this sphere of specialist rural news media out there that has very much a conservative agenda that serves agrarian political thought. These things don't often seem to make it into academic discussion in Australia, but when taken together, I think a clear narrative emerges, and that we should be critically interrogating it for a number of reasons, beginning with balancing the bias accusations against the ABC when it has these old and powerful programs and a powerful arm that serves conservative political forces so well, through to engaging critically with media representations of remote, rural and regional Australia, such as those programs about ice use, to see what this tells us about the way we imagine our country, and particularly regional Australia and our relationships with First Nations. I began, although you couldn't see it because the slide wasn't showing, but I did begin with the First Nations map, and I return to it now, and I've put this other map of settler imagining of Australian regions or areas. And I return to it now to suggest that when we're thinking about regional media throughout the conference, we should be sensitive to the fact that for the most part, our discussions glide right over settler agendas and how regional spaces are imagined for the nation and for regional communities themselves. These representations have really deep histories that are naturalised through mainstream media and dominant settler culture. And this perpetuates particular ideas about not only who we are, but what's important and how we should talk about and understand this country. I think studying regional media can unsettle these powerful discourses and in the process tell us much about our society and ourselves. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. I just wanted to see if anyone has any questions. Seeing some great things coming up through the chat, particularly around where everyone is situated today. We just wanted to find out if there's any questions specifically for Lisa. I will say one thing from someone who grew up in Shepparton and also goes back for family. I've never seen that car park so empty that they showed. So I don't know when they filmed that, but I've never seen it that empty.
Yeah, that's so interesting. It really is a representation.
Just waiting to see if there's any questions coming through. I do want to thank, whilst we're waiting for questions, and it's coming through on the chat anyway, thanks, Lisa. That was a great presentation, really fitting for the conference and where we go from here. So I'm very happy that we started with your keynote address today. I think it raises many points, many discussion points that I think will come through the various papers that we have over the coming days. So thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Got one from Sybil. I'm not sure if you can see the chat there, Lisa.
Oh, yes, about problematic aspects of ABC radio as opposed to TV in terms of regional coverage, and talking about what solutions might be there. I don't know. I think that these programs, and I might just say particularly the Queensland edition, so I didn't go into the findings there very much, but particularly the Queensland edition has got, I think, just such a hardline agenda and such a narrow way of talking about the rural space that I don't particularly see solutions there. I think with ABC Rural, we've seen some response to criticism of the way that it imagines regional and rural Australia. So, for example, Backroads, which is a program lots of people will be familiar with, got quite a lot of criticism a couple of series ago that there were no First Nations representations coming through on that show, and they've made a real effort. They now always show a map locating the First Nation where they're coming from or covering, and they've made a really deliberate attempt, I think, to include narratives and voices from First Nations people in that program. I think that's really, that's a solution. I think sometimes it's as simple as just actually acknowledging people within the space. And watching Country Hour, we've seen some little bits of programming like that, and I'd have to say that the New South Wales edition, since we've published this work, has probably been the best at actually actively raising Indigenous issues on its agenda. But again, it's it's tiny bit of it.
We've got one more question around the Ray Martin ad campaign, and a question around how did it play out and how did you see it connected to what you spoke about in the last part of the paper about ABC Rural?
Well, it was interesting. I know that a group of academics were invited by ACM to write commentary pieces for ACM papers around the campaign. And I think a couple of people did actually do that. And it bothered me a little bit at the time because I wondered whether they were engaging critically with the way that the campaign was positioning audiences in relation to the media organisations' agendas, but also the way it was using Ray Martin, who's done a few of these kind of commercial TV programs that really draw on regional and rural tropes. Like, I just showed you a tiny bit of it. Like, it was so over the top, that Channel 7 Ice Moral Panic program. It was just crazy. And this ad campaign didn't come a long time after that. So we've got Ray Martin once again positioned in this idealised kind of rural setting, calling for the fair go. And it was just concerning to me that people weren't thinking about what that was drawing on and what it really meant, and how media organisations based in the city were drawing on these kinds of tropes.
Do you think what we've seen over the last 18 months might further the divide between metro and regional? We've seen, particularly in Victoria, lockdowns, but it's always metro versus regional. And how does the mass media play out with those? I mean, we've got regional papers that are talking specifically about what's just happening in their region, but then we have the statewide papers very much presenting a very different picture. So are we going to continue to see maybe a further divide between regional newspapers and our metro counterparts?
Oh, I wouldn't say we'd see a change anytime soon, and I guess that comes back to that binary that I was talking about. We fall so easily into this divide between the city and the country, and on a program like Country Hour, this gets used all the time. So we have both presenters on Country Hour and their rural and political conservative guests on the show, often saying, well, city people just wouldn't understand. They should keep out of these debates. What would they know about the state of our river or how things are playing out here? And then on the other hand, I had that slide. I'm sorry people missed out on some slides, but that slide that, was making a joke of the kind of idealised view of life in the country, and I know from colleagues, people saying, oh, you're so lucky, you don't live in the city, you're so much more free. And yes, to some extent that might be true, but we have these ways of imagining and talking about each other. So I think people will just continue to pull on that. As I said at the end, these things have got really, really deep histories, and they go deep into our consciousness, our cultural consciousness. It's the easy thing to do.
I did want to thank Michael, who has reminded me in the chat. We do have Lucy as our guest speaker tomorrow, who runs a regional newspaper, or a massive regional newspaper, and there's some great things happening with that. So please come to Lucy's presentation tomorrow. I just wanted to see if there's any further questions. It's 20 past at the moment.
I can see a question there from Robert about divisions within the regions between the elites and ordinary people and recent arrivals. And I'd just say, Robert, one of my collaborators in the work around ABC Rural isn't really an academic. He's an independent researcher. He lives in Townsville. And he sees himself very much as an ordinary listener. He's been listening to Country Hour in Queensland for many, many years. And he was the one that brought the idea of doing this research to me, because he was saying, hey, I'm an ordinary guy and I don't particularly share these views, or, I've got a different experience, and there are lots of other people out there with a different experience. And, it's really interesting that this program, in the way that it imagines the space by the people it has on, by the kinds of stories that it tells, doesn't speak to me, but says it speaks for me. It's not the only way to do things. I know that in ACM newspapers at the moment, certainly here in Ballarat, and I'd imagine it's across the basin, they're running a really interesting campaign through the online and the printed paper about the Darling River. And it's very much from the point of view of ordinary people and people in those places fighting to save the river. So, it just goes to the point that there are further discourses available, and that not everybody in the space identifies with the way that they're portrayed, or with the debates that are being presented to them through the media.
Okay, I've just one more question. We might make this the final one, and then we'll wrap up. From Jennifer, about the country-city binary, would you see that, as well as excluding Indigenous, it also encourages a view of uniformity on the city, i.e. simplifies plurality?
Yeah, I think that whenever you get a binary, that's what happens, isn't it? That things get essentialized, or kind of boiled down into these very uniform representations that aren't really very helpful. We all recognize them, they're really familiar, but they don't actually help to do anything except really intensify the status quo. So they're really unhelpful.
Okay, I think as you mentioned, Lisa, it's the beginning of the conference. You have allowed us a number of thinking points that I think are going to come right through for the coming days. We're going to end this session now. We're going to take a bit of a break, and then we're going to move on to the concurrent session. So for those, please check your schedules. We've got concurrent sessions now up until, I'm just going through it myself, up until 3 o'clock, and then we'll come back for another session, a panel session altogether. If you have any concerns, any questions, please reach out to myself or any of the other VU events team. But we're going to take a break now, and then at 10:45, we'll start the first of the concurrent sessions. All right. Thank you. Thanks again, Lisa.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening. Bye.